Hello and welcome to day two of the Imagine Belfast Festival of Ideas and Politics. If this is your first time in the festival this week, you're very welcome. If this is your first time in the festival over any time in the last 9 years, you're particularly appreciated that you've decided to join us today. I'm Alan Meban. Did I tell you that before? I normally forget, so I'll kind of catch up. But anyway, I'm delighted really today to be here with George Monbiot, the journalist and author. He'll be talking a bit about his latest book, Regenesis, which is all about feeding the world without devouring the planet. We'll get into that in a bit of a minute. But first of all, George, you're very welcome to Imagine. Thanks for taking the time to be with us this afternoon.
Thanks a lot, Alan. Lovely to talk to you.
Yeah, and I suppose we're talking remotely, and maybe that can come up in the conversation in terms of the fact that we have to be a bit more sustainable about some of these things in terms of making journeys. But for those who are watching online, if you're watching it live, feel free to put some comments or pose some questions on YouTube, and I'll see if those kind of fit into the conversation as we go. Can't promise to ask them all, but see if we can feed some of those in. It'd be nice to make you all part of the conversation. And I suppose, George, rather than jump to the conclusion of your book, which my mum would probably have said is a bit of a gunk. So kind of brace yourselves at home if you haven't read it or don't know what the conclusion is going to be. But can we start with maybe some of the fundamentals? In this book, I mean, you're talking a lot about food and production and the food chain and the food system and so on, but soil seems to be really at the heart of understanding where the complexity of some of this starts. Can you give us a bit of an intro to the science of what's underneath our feet?
Yeah. Well, it's our most neglected ecosystem, and it's amazing that we've neglected it so much and studied it so little because it produces 99% of our calories. It's fundamental to the survival of all terrestrial life on Earth, including and especially ourselves, and yet we treat it like dirt. It's literally and metaphorically beneath us. And when I say an ecosystem, even that probably surprises a lot of people. People tend to think of soil as just stuff, right? Just mud, a load of minerals and organic material. But it's not just an ecosystem, it's actually a biological structure. It's like a coral reef. If it weren't for the creatures living in it, there would be no soil. It would just wash straight off the land. And it's the creatures which give it the structure that enables it to stay on the land. So starting at the most micro level, the bacteria, of which there are huge numbers in the soil, they make little tiny capsules in which they live, which have almost magical properties. Even when you air dry soil, it's still 98% humidity inside those capsules. And then out of those little capsules, the tiny scuttling creatures that you can see with a hand lens, the microarthropods, they make slightly bigger clumps. And then the giants of the soil, the earthworms and the ants, they make bigger clumps still. And it's fractally scaled, which means it has the same structure at every level of magnification, which gives soil its resilience. But it's also got a number of properties which, well, they're pretty mind-blowing when you start to investigate them. So if you take, for instance, the relationship between a plant and the soil that surrounds it, it's just so much more complicated than we first imagined, but in a really amazing, wonderful way. So I think the thing which triggered my fascination with soil more than anything else was the discovery, reading scientific papers, that plants can talk. They can talk in a highly sophisticated chemical language. It's very precise. When a little plant root, a root hair, breaks into a clump of soil, what it does is to send out a very specific signal. So in that clump of soil, there might be thousands of bacterial species, most of them living in a state of dormancy, just waiting for something to come along, for better times to turn up. And the plant sends a signal that only one of those species or a couple of those species can hear. And that signal, which is a very long and complex chemical generally, says, wake up. And it's that particular one that it's talking to. And when it's got that microbe's attention, it then floods it with sugar. And amazingly, between about 11% and 40% of all the sugars that plants produce by photosynthesis is poured into the soil. And the purpose of that is to feed its favoured bacterial species so that they can build their numbers up until they form one of the densest bacterial communities on Earth immediately surrounding the root hair. And we call that the rhizosphere. And they, in return for those sugars, they give the plant three things, or three main things. One of them is they deliver minerals from the soil, which the plant can't otherwise obtain. Secondly, they defend the root against pathogens, against harmful bacteria, fungi, other damaging things in the soil. And thirdly, they help to stimulate the plant's immune system so that it can better defend itself. Now, when you think of those three functions, maybe there's something, a slight faint bell ringing in the back of your mind. Haven't we heard this story before? You think a really dense bacterial community, exchanging sugars for minerals, defending against pathogens, stimulating the immune system. Hang on, it's the human gut. And basically, the rhizosphere functions in an almost identical way to the way the human gut functions. It is the plant's external gut. And amazingly, out of 1,000 or so phyla, major groups of bacteria, there are 4 which dominate in the human gut, and there are 4 which dominate in the rhizosphere, and they're the same 4.
And so you start to build a picture here of the fact that we, at an artificial level, those of us who aren't gardeners or aren't kind of don't grow things, but we kind of have a notion of, well, the plant needs to look healthy at the top. We're looking for green leaves. We don't want too much brown. What the difference between a weed and a plant that you actually were trying to cultivate. But what you're starting to kind of say is that there's a huge complexity to the chemical nature, but also the physical structure underneath, and the various critters, from bacteria to actual worms. They're all actually playing a part in what makes soil healthy, or what keeps it healthy over time as you get into kind of the world of farming, which tends to be terribly intensive, or certainly very intentional in terms of what you're actually planting and what you're hoping to get out of it. Do the people who need to understand soil really understand it? Do you think kind of the average farmer kind of really understands what's kind of happening in underneath their feet, or are they just kind of doing what their dad did and what the generation before that did?
Well, in fairness, nobody does. Nobody understands it. There was a paper published in 2020 which said we think we might know what soil is now. And then I met the authors of that paper last year, and they said, on reflection and in light of further research, actually, we still haven't got a clue what soil is. And it's just got these weird properties which nobody yet understands. I mean, it is a very, very strange and fascinating thing. So, for example, it seems to respond as a body to environmental change, almost as if the soil itself is a living organism. So if soil carbon rises, so does the length of the DNA amongst all the microbes in the soil all at the same time. But the number of RNA operons in those same microbes falls at the same time, and vice versa. If the soil carbon declines, the entire microbial genome shrinks, while the number of RNA operons rises, which suggests a metabolic response, a collective metabolic response. And some scientists are going so far as to talk of the soil's metagenome, almost as if the soil itself has a genome, a collective genome composed of all the genomes of the organisms that live in it. It's really wacky. I mean, there's stuff going on which we just have no idea what we're looking at, which is amazing and fascinating, but also blinking terrifying when you think that we are completely dependent on this ecosystem for our survival, and we're trashing it at a horrendous rate. The speed of soil erosion and soil degradation is frankly terrifying. And in order to produce the food we need today, we're severely compromising our ability to feed ourselves in the future. And so, to a very large extent, our future survival is going to depend on soil science. It's going to depend on knowing much more about it. And it seems to me that while we've sort of succeeded in feeding ourselves very effectively over the past 100 years or so through understanding soil chemistry, we're only going to be able to sustain that if we start to understand soil biology. and that actually soil biology is in the long run more important than soil chemistry. It's a real key to sustainable farming, sustainable food production.
One of the people that you met along the way writing this book, there's a lot of kind of different characters that we kind of come across, but Tully seems to be one of the ones who he recurs. He keeps kind of coming back again as to somebody who's doing something interesting. I mean, from memory, he had a relatively small kind of holding in a sense, but it was really, really poor. It was really, really poor condition. Effectively, I think you described it as rubble, and effectively he has managed to farm that without pesticide, without actually kind of having to scrape the entire thing off into somewhere else and then kind of fill it again. But he's actually managed to improve the condition of the soil and get kind of reasonable, in fact, quite miraculous kind of yields out of it. Does that give you some kind of hope for the fact that actually, even though we're trashing the place, the soil can recover, that given 5 or 7 years, you can actually get it back into a much better state than it was?
So I think the holy grail in all farming or all food production is low impacts and high yields. We need to maintain high yields because we need to feed everyone without sprawling all over the planet. We should, like all the resources we use, and perhaps more important than any other resource, we should minimize our use of land in order to feed ourselves. And that means that yields have to be high. But in order to produce those high yields, we've been doing terrible things to the living world, trashing the soil, sucking up all the water. We're maxed out in many parts of the world in terms of water supplies, spreading pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers with gay abandon over the planet, trashing its ecosystems, devastating food webs. And so we have to get the impacts down while keeping the yields high. And there are very few people who have succeeded in doing this. And Tolly, who's a commercial grower, in other words, a vegetable producer rather than an arable crop producer, he's succeeded in doing this on, as you say, very poor land, 40% stone, basically rubble. When he pulls the tractor over it, you can hear it going, ting, 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 ting. It makes music. And he's done so without any fertilizers or any manure. He calls himself a veganic grower, so it's sort of completely animal free, but also fertilizer free. And he uses no pesticides, no herbicides, anything. And what he's done is to anticipate by about 20 years the latest findings in soil ecology. He sort of intuitively grasped what was going on. His original interest is in wood and trees. And his great breakthrough was to understand that what we call agricultural soils are actually forest soils. They were originally, they had trees growing on them in almost all cases, in places like the UK and indeed in Ireland. And what they want, how they sort of behave best at their optimum is when they think they've got trees growing on them. And so what Tolly has done is to try to mimic the litter fall from trees, because in a forest you've got this constant fall of twigs and leaves and little bits of tree hitting the ground, small amounts of carbon, not in a big dump, but just, I mean, occasionally a tree falls over, then you've got a big dump of carbon, and of course in autumn you've got a fairly big dump of carbon, but throughout the year a sort of a slow sort of rainfall of carbon hitting the ground. And so what he's done is to add a millimetre of wood chip on average every year at a particularly key point in his rotation. And that seems to have, as well as several other interesting and clever things he's doing, that seems to be the key innovation which mediates the relationship between plants, bacteria, and fungi in the soil. And what that enables is that those bacteria and fungi operate much more effectively as the portal through which minerals pass. And when the soil is functioning optimally, as Tolly seems to have got it functioning, they will deliver nutrients when the plant needs them, which is a process called mineralization. and lock up the nutrients when the plant doesn't need them, which is called immobilization. And those two aspects are equally important, because if you don't lock up the nutrients when they're not in demand, they'll just flow away through the soil and cause pollution somewhere downstream. Whereas you want to keep hold of every nutrient you possibly can in your field. And he seems to have found a way of doing that. Now, the interesting thing is that quite a few growers have been able to replicate what he's doing, but some haven't. And we have no idea why that is. It's got something to do with the soil. It's on different soils. Some people can do it, some people can't. And it's our lack of understanding of soil biology which prevents us from seeing why that is and what changes you might need to make to this technique in order to be able to ensure it works elsewhere. And this is one of the many questions that we urgently need to answer. And but soil science is like a Cinderella subject. There's hardly any money for it. There's beginning to be some interest in it now, but it's been neglected for decades.
We're kind of doing like a broad brush kind of biology, farming, agriculture lesson here, and we'll come back to discussing what this means for human beings probably quite soon. But I mean, you mentioned the word rotation. Oh, I suppose the other thing is, if you're watching online, feel free to pop some questions in, post some questions in YouTube and in the comments, and we can kind of feed those in. Little worms will drag them through the soil into my ecosystem here. But you mentioned the word, George, rotation. I mean, that's something that I think a lot of us will be familiar with, the idea of. I think even in gardens, there's a kind of a sense of, you can't always just assume that roses will grow in the corner because roses have always grown in the corner. There's a certain amount of, you do need to kind of move things around over time and refresh the soil and do different things. But rotation, there's much more of a science to it, in terms of, it's not just swapping between animals and arable, or it's not just between kind of putting rapeseed oil or something kind of onto it at one point and then kind of coming back. You need to be a bit more structured about it, and to understand it more, you may need to be much less intensive in what you're trying to grow in order to actually get much better yields of when you do try. Is that kind of a good summary?
So there's lots of reasons why we should be rotating, but also keeping the soil covered at all times. There should be something growing, ideally, on your soil at all times, so that you need to have a cover crop coming up underneath your main crop at any one time, so that the soil's not left bare. When it's left bare, when the sun can see it, when the rain can hit it directly, when the wind can hit it directly, that's when you see very major soil degradation happen. And that's why, switching to maize, for instance, as we've been doing, I don't know about in Ireland, but here in the UK in a big way, both to feed dairy cattle, so I expect you are doing it, and to feed biodigesters to make biogas. It's an absolute catastrophe, because it's harvested late in the year. It takes a long time to mature in the spring, and so the soil is left bare for long periods, and it's incredibly destructive to soil. And so, keeping the soil covered. Rotations are really important, so that you don't get the pests building up, just carrying on. They say, we like eating wheat, and they're giving us wheat again, so let's just carry on eating the wheat. You need to break that cycle, and if your wheat crop's being attacked, you put beans in or something, which ensures that the same pests can't then attack that crop. But you also, different crops have different nutrient demands. All this is fundamental, but what a lot of farmers are calling for now is new crops that they can patch into their rotation, because they're very short of effective crops. We have these commodity super cycles, which means that everyone chases the same market, growing the same things, and in some cases those crops can no longer be grown because too many people were growing them. So if you look at oilseed rape, for instance, here in the UK, in many parts of the UK, it's now impossible to grow it because so many people grew it more or less as a monoculture. Flea beetles here went completely berserk. The larvae bore into the stems of the rapeseed plants, and it's just, you just can't grow it. If you plant it now, it just gets eaten immediately. and so there has to be a sort of collective response. We have to try to see the bigger picture of what needs to be done, rather than pursuing your own interests on your own fields alone.
We should probably talk about animals. Let's do that twice. Once, the things above the ground, we've kind of understood what's happening underneath the soil to some extent, but actually the aphids, all the little kind of tiny predatory things that are meant to eat your plant and destroy it, and hence why pesticides and so on are used. But those can actually be quite healthy in a sense, because if you've got a balanced kind of your argument is, if you've got a kind of a balanced set of things, crops, or whatever you're actually producing, then the ecosystem finds an equilibrium, doesn't it? And it actually, what appears to be a pest isn't, because something looks after it, and something else, it becomes part of the life cycle
Well,
itself.
well, one of the shocking things that Tolly says is I deliberately cultivate pests, and when he said that to me, I said, surely you mean predators? He said, no, pests. If you don't keep the pests alive, you can't keep the predators
Hmm.
alive. So you have to have a reservoir of pests in order to ensure that you've got the ground beetles and the aphid midges and the spiders and the lacewings and the ladybirds and the other things which are going to eat the next load of pests, because they reproduce more slowly than the pests do. So if there's no pests at all, if you've wiped them all out with a pesticide, there's going to be no predators. And so when the next wave of pests come in, they're going to devastate your crops before the predator numbers can build up
Yeah.
sufficiently. And so to get a balanced system, you have to have reservoirs of wildlife, including the wildlife that eats your crops.
But it's not the end of the world, because you've thought about that and kind of factored it in. Let's talk about bigger animals though, because as you kind of mentioned, I mean, kind of dairy, big in Northern Ireland. We have more pigs than we have people, if I remember my stats correctly. Though they don't seem to live as long, they seem to turn into sausages quite quickly. We were kind of a lamb exporter kind of around the world. Brexit has done its thing, but we're still very much in terms of an animal kind of growing, supplying kind of place. You have fears though about the sustainability of just how healthy it is to the soil, how healthy it is to land, how much land you need in order to kind of grow, or you don't grow animals, do you? But in order to farm them, tell us a little bit about that in general before we get to the
Yeah.
maybe the kind of the big reveal, which is kind of, well, what do we eat if we?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's just impossible for us to sustain our animal eating habits. We we've been able to eat animals up till now because not everyone has done so, and not everyone has eaten a lot. Basically, the richer people get, the more meat they eat. That's a fundamental rule. There's even a term for it, Bennett's law, that as people become richer, they want more energy dense food, particularly protein rich and fat rich food, and so they eat more and more animal products. And as a result of that, we have a population crisis. People say, oh, yes, the population crisis. No, that's not what I'm talking about. Human population is leveling off. In fact, it's one of the very few environmental indicators which is beginning to plateau. It's below 1% growth down. It's come right down. But the livestock population, yeah, that's the crisis. That's growing at 2.4% a year. Now, already we have this extraordinary situation where only 4% of the world's mammals by weight are wild ones. 36% of the weight of mammals on Earth is human beings, and 60% is livestock. It's an extraordinary statistic, and that, unless we radically change, is only going to get worse, because at the current rate of growth, there's going to be 100 million tons of extra human being on Earth by 2050, and 400 million tons of extra livestock on Earth.
And
They're eating,
what's the downside to just having a few more friendly cows and chickens and lambs around the place?
they are eating us to extinction. So, they have to be fed. And there's two ways of doing it. One way is intensive production, producing grain, keeping your animals indoors, in huge steel factories, your pigs, your chickens, increasingly now your dairy cows. And it's the farming we don't see, but it's the farming that supplies almost all our animal products. If you're eating animal products, you're almost certainly eating products of factory farming, animals kept in horrendous conditions, being fed on grain, generally grown on the other side of the world, soy from Brazil, maize from the US, shipped around the world, passed through these animals. A great deal of the nutrients in that grain comes out in their poo. And that has to go somewhere. It's low value, high volume, so it's going to go somewhere locally. It's going to be spread on the fields, and farmers will say, oh, we're fertilizing the fields. But in these big sheds, there's far too much poo produced for the soil and the plants to be able to absorb those nutrients. And so a large part of the nutrients washes off and goes into the rivers. And that's why Ireland's rivers are dying. Even famous rivers like the Shannon are being killed primarily as a result of animal manure. It's the same here in the UK too, in Great Britain rather. Exactly the same, but both sides of the sea, we've got this really, really big problem. And so so that's one way of doing it. The intensive animal keeping, everyone hates that, and yet almost everyone eats its products. We're in a state of total denial about it. There was a survey in the US where over 95% of people eat meat. 47% of people wanted to ban slaughterhouses. That's how deliberately ignorant we are of where our
We
food
need more
is coming
lemmings.
from.
Yeah. And I
So,
guess,
so the other side. So can I just say
yeah.
the other side, which is, so the other way of growing animals is to have them feeding on grass outdoors. And people say, oh, well, we like that. That's all right. In environmental terms, this is much, much worse than that horrendous situation of the animals inside the huge steel sheds. And that's because of the enormous amount of land use. This is a really inefficient way of producing animal products. So you need a great deal of land to produce not very much food. And land is, I believe, the number one environmental parameter. It's the most important issue of all, because every hectare of land that we use for our own purposes is a hectare of land that can't be occupied by wild ecosystems, by forests, by wetlands, by the other self-supporting wild ecosystems which would otherwise survive. The great majority of the world's species depend on wild ecosystems, and Earth systems as a whole depend on wild ecosystems. We will not get through this century unless we turn considerable amounts of land back to nature. Now, what is by far and away the biggest land use on Earth, greater than all other forms of human land use put together? Grazing animals. While 1% of the planet's surface is used for building, all the homes, all the industry, all the infrastructure on Earth occupies 1% of the land surface. And crops occupy 12% of the land surface, almost half of which is to produce food for livestock rather than direct for human beings. Grazing livestock occupies 26% of the land surface. That's more than all other human uses put together. And much of the rest is desert, is ice-capped mountains, some protected areas and forests. And so that is the most wasteful, damaging, profligate thing that humans do. Is having grazing livestock. And we've had this big push from the livestock industry, supported by certain know-nothing celebrity chefs and food writers saying, oh, eat pasture-fed meat, that's the answer. Look, isn't it lovely? They're seeing the pictures, they're not seeing the numbers. The fundamental problem is that we're food innumerate, we're not seeing the numbers. There was a study in the United States that said, what if we did what the food writers are telling us to do and switch from grain-fed beef, which is bad enough, to pasture-fed beef, which is what they say. Well, they've found that you'd have to expand the land area used for keeping cattle in the United States by 270%. That would mean you would have to cut down all the forests, water all the deserts, drain all the wetlands, degazette the national parks, demolish all the cities, and you'd still be importing much of your beef from Brazil. We just don't have the space for it. If we had several planets and no space for wild ecosystems on any of them, yeah, maybe then we could eat pasture-fed beef and lamb. But as we don't, we should be taking those animals off the land, just stopping that industry. It is the most damaging industry of all, more damaging in terms of the ratio of production to destruction than any other industry on Earth, with the possible exception of scallop dredging. And we should just stop it and rewild that land.
And so we can either turn left or right in this conversation, I think, because there's a whole interesting avenue of there's a whole set of things that you talk about in the book that come to make me think, yes, the assumption that most of us carry around in our heads is the following, but actually it's completely wrong. The what looks obvious is wrong. So the let's let everything be kind of wild, just let it all graze outside and we'll eat it. It's free reign sounds like a great idea, but actually probably putting them in a shed and force feeding them something, it might not be any more ethical, but it might be a whole lot less ethical, but it would be better for the environment in a sense. But and that when we come to food wastage, there's a whole set of things that we can kind of turn in our head. I suppose what the other question that we probably should get to is what's the solution to all of this? I mean, you do by the time we get to about chapter 7 of the book, you do basically come out with something which I wasn't expecting. I was kind of expecting lots of rewilding. We need to be kind of a bit more. Maybe we'd eat local. We wouldn't do as much transportation, but that's another one of those things you could turn on its head. But actually, you have a proposition for people that says, here's a different way of eating, and it's.
Yeah.
I mean, I think if you're following along at home, you're going to predict. I think he's going to say, don't eat animals. However, it's not just that. It's you jump a couple of sharks, and so tell us a bit about what you've discovered and your pitch for the future.
Yeah. So it starts with don't eat animals. Yeah, sure, but that's never going to be enough. It's just like if we're saying don't use fossil fuels, and you say, okay, what are we going to do instead? And some people will say, well, just eat a plant-based diet, but actually the great majority of people are simply not prepared to do that. It's as if we were saying don't use fossil fuels, but there's no such thing as solar power, no such thing as wind power. You're just going to have to use less energy or stop using energy altogether. People won't accept that. And we need a similar technological leap if we're going to wean people off animal farming and animal consumption, which is up there with fossil fuels as the worst thing we're doing to the planet. Possibly worse than fossil fuels in terms of the sheer impact on so many different living systems. So what can we do? Well, there's a lot of people trying to make better plant products which are more like animal products. And some of them are pretty good. Some of them are terrible. Often people's first encounter with a plant-based substitute for an animal product is really dire and puts them off for life. But what we need is products which are cheaper than animal products, which are healthier, which are just as tasty, which ideally are indistinguishable from them. And we now have the potential to do that. And it's a potential which comes from a completely different place. So for the past 12,000 years or so, we have concentrated on farming multicellular organisms, plants and animals. And we've taken them to the absolute limit in terms of what they can produce. In fact, with some of them, like chickens, we've taken them beyond that limit to a point at which their bodies just collapse under the weight, literally the weight of what we've done to them. But we've scarcely touched the potential of unicellular organisms. This huge, vast panoply of microbes that surrounds us. Now, we eat microbes with every meal. Our food is full of them. We deliberately introduce them into some of our food, like yogurt and cheese and bread and beer and kimchi and sauerkraut and stuff. But now we have the potential to farm them deliberately and specifically to make protein-rich and fat-rich foods which could produce far better, more realistic, less processed substitutes for animal products with a tiny fraction of the environmental impact. Now, I'm the first person on earth outside the laboratory to eat a pancake made from bacterial flour, which tasted just like a pancake. Small flip for man. But it's the very beginning of this massive new food revolution which is beginning, and it's based on what we call precision fermentation, a refined form of brewing. We've been doing that for 40 or 50 years to produce specific products like insulin or chimazin, which is a substitute for rennet that most hard cheese is now made with. Vitamins, if anyone listening takes vitamin supplements or eats food with vitamins in, that comes from precision fermentation, enzymes, lots of other things like that. But now we're just beginning to do it to produce bulk protein, and proteins which are much closer in their profile to animal proteins than plant proteins are, much higher concentrations. They aren't tangled up with all the plant secondary products which taint your meat substitutes and make them taste like something other than meat. There's this huge technological revolution in the offing, which is likely to follow a sort of digital style of deployment, because you can produce this stuff soon very cheaply indeed, and it requires a tiny fraction of the resources. So there's one study comparing protein made from methanol consuming bacteria. They don't require any agricultural feedstock at all. You just make it from solar power. And you need 1,700 times less land to produce those bacteria than the most efficient way of producing protein today, which is soy grown in the US. And that means you need 132,000 times less land than required to produce protein from beef. You also need far less water, far less fertilizer, and it's all contained. It
So
doesn't spill out.
you've
into
loads
the
more forests, you have loads more natural,
You
just
can then
the world.
rewild the planet,
Yeah.
on a massive scale, and it's very hard to see how we're going to get through the century unless we do that.
What
We
are the
have to stop the sixth great extinction. We have to draw down much of the carbon we've already released into the atmosphere, and I can't see any other way of doing it.
what are the risks with this? Because anything new, there's normally some downside around the corner, or it can be exploited, or we're kind of so like from a human body point of view, we've kind of evolved for a long time, kind of
Yeah.
eating some of the creatures around us, eating some of the kind of the plants that were growing around us. Going back to unicellular, will our will our organs kind of complain about this?
Well, I mean, we do eat them all the time. I mean, our food
Yeah.
is absolutely stuffed with
Well, if we
microbes.
stop
Our
eating the
guts are
rest,
stuffed
we're
with microbes. Yeah, but yeah, all novel foods must be properly tested. It's really essential that is. I mean, it's not clear why they would do us in. We're talking about the same amino acids. We're talking about protein profiles midway between animal and plant. Really very similar food to what our bodies are used to. The real danger comes with replicating what's already evident in the food system, which is corporate concentration. That's where the real danger comes. Now, already we have a highly concentrated food system. For instance, 4 corporations control 90% of the global grain trade. Now, what's the answer to that? You don't say, well, let's ban the grain trade, because if you did that, billions would immediately starve. You have to break up the corporations. And in all cases, not just in food, but in every commercial sector, antitrust laws should be strong and intellectual property laws should be weak. And governments have failed on both those counts. They've allowed intellectual property rights to get strong and antitrust laws to get weak. So we got this great gift to humanity now, which is being delivered to us in the form of these alternative proteins. We can't allow this gift to be captured by a few corporations. So we should be getting in there now to say, let's not see happening in the new food economy what's happened in the old food economy. Let's not replicate its dysfunctions, because we need a sustainable, resilient food system, and its resilience is undermined by corporate concentration.
And yet, if you're suggesting a kind of a factory-based science approach of fermenting stuff, it basically talks about IPR. It talks about the rights that, gosh, Northern Ireland could do well out of this, because we know a lot about brewing. But we could be, Bushmills could be producing yellow flour for pancakes instead of whiskey, and I would probably get sacked for saying such a thing. There's a couple of questions here from one from Declan and one from Sean, who's up at Queen's University. I mean, there are big lobby groups, there are big interest groups involved in this. I mean, I think I was saying earlier to you, I mean, in terms of Northern Ireland, we were the last part of the UK to have a climate bill in terms of our kind of devolved government. That took a lot of fight from those kind of eco groups who actually wanted to have one. It took a private member's bill to provoke the department to actually give the minister one. His eventually went forward with lots of amendments. It was watered down in places. We had bizarre arguments in the assembly locally about the number of cows we have and the fact that we are a small place, so our cows should be allowed to produce methane because it doesn't really matter. You really want to get the guys in Brazil to stop, and they were kind of It certainly was not all about us playing our part and doing our proportional bit. We needed lots of kind of loopholes to kind of get out of. The farmers' unions, big kind of lobbying blocks, but also corporates, as you said. So, I mean, how do we? I mean, if you were to be successful, if your mission is to kind of change how we eat, how do you get around that? Because at some point, this turns into real politics, and it turns into real corporate money and shareholders and people who would really they wouldn't do you a good turn unless they could make a profit.
Yeah. So I mean, we obviously are up against the power of legacy industries, and it's the same everywhere. It's the same with fossil fuels. The issue always is not the new stuff you get into; it's the old stuff you get out of. That's always the political sticking point. Keeping fossil fuels in the ground is the bit that's missing. We've been pretty good at developing alternatives. We've been really bad at shutting down the things we're trying to get away from. Now, with livestock farming, it's much easier because the great majority of livestock farmers in countries like the UK are dependent on subsidies for their survival, public money. They would not be there. They would not be doing what they do, this most destructive of all industries, if we weren't paying for it out of our taxes. And so we pay them to do something different. We say, we'll still give you money, that's fine, and you're going to lose less because all this free range production is loss making, massively so in many cases, particularly with like sheep in the hills, which is a tremendously destructive and economically insane thing to be doing. You just lose money on every carcass you deliver. And so let's pay you same money, but we'll pay you to restore nature instead. It won't cost you so much, so you'll actually end up making more money than before, but you'll be delivering public goods for that public money rather than public harm.
And in about 90 seconds there, you made yourself public enemy number one with every farmer and every farmer's family and their heritage. And you basically said you got to stop doing what you're doing because basically you're not good at it. Well, you might be good at it on your own terms, but you're not good at it on a world environment group. I mean, it's a very difficult message. I mean, is there anywhere that is actually, is there any small country or large country that's actually said, here's the incentives to actually try some of this? Even before we get to the unicellular, protein-rich kind of flour. But when we're kind of sitting at the level of just let's rewild the place and change our eating habits, anywhere had to do that?
Yes, Costa Rica's done it on really with spectacular results. It's realised that its forests are worth more to it than the cattle that were being produced there instead, and there's been a massive reforestation, and the result has been a great boost to the economy. More tourists come. There's lots of nature-based economic activities building up, and the results have been amazing. To a smaller extent, the Netherlands has done it, and that might sound like a strange thing to say given the current situation, but it's by creating room for the rivers in order to prevent flooding. It accidentally rewilded very large areas of land. And it turns out that those areas are extremely effective at generating jobs and income, far more so than the farming that was happening there before. So, for instance, in Gelderse Poort, there's which is one of these sites which was done to protect the cities downstream from flooding, but turned into this amazing rewilding place, now employs 6 times as many people as the maize and dairy farms which were there before. And so it's people can cling to the old industries, but what we see with those old industries is that they're not continuing to generate new employment. We're losing people from those industries all the time. Communities are dying. We should, as a matter of course, even if there weren't the environmental constraints, we should be looking to diversify out of those industries and into something which actually offered a better option for employment and for income and for local communities. But it's sort of clinging to these dying industries, which has always been the undoing of places in economic trouble. And I think, my message is get ahead of the game. Don't get trapped in an industry which isn't going anywhere, which is only going to go downhill. Make the move before you're forced out, and the move is there to be made. There's enormous opportunities Northern Ireland could do really well out of this, as you suggest. But you have to get in there early if you're going to do so.
I await to see whether we'll be the first on the bandwagon. Certainly, our current politics wouldn't suggest there'll be any incentives coming from central government to do it. Yesterday, there was a publication of a report from the UN, scientists basically suggesting that the key global temperature goals will be missed. Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, said countries need to bring forward their net zero plans by a decade. So effectively, whatever they ramming this foot on the accelerator to say, and putting the blue flashing lights on to say, yeah, you got these great plans, but actually it's much more urgent than we were thinking because you're not really getting there fast enough. Does that mean that we don't have a lot of time to? Would you argue that we don't have a lot of time to play with in order to? Because normally you would experiment for 50 years, you would allow Costa Rica to develop and fail a few times and come back again, and we would write some papers. We would look at this. Would you suggest that we don't really have time to watch and see? We just everybody needs to experiment? Is that the answer?
Well, this is an emergency situation. And I mean, it's not a massive experiment. It's not like we're doing things which are radically new. As I say, technologies like precision fermentation have been around for 40 or 50 years. But it's a question of putting the resources in and putting the political commitment in. And, in the past, economies have turned around on a dime. You look at what happened after Pearl Harbor when the US joined the Second World War. It was a matter of about 3 months. It turned from being a civilian economy to being a military economy in almost every respect. The huge car plants were completely repurposed. Men went in with jackhammers, pulled out all the vast machinery, put in new machinery, and within a few weeks, they were turning out planes, they were turning out tanks, they were turning out missiles where previously they'd been turning out automobiles. Every aspect of the economy was transformed effectively overnight. The entire nation was mobilized for the war effort. There were, in effect, no civilians anymore because everybody was contributing to that war effort. It's the implications of what they were doing aren't great, but the Manhattan Project, it was just seemed completely impossible that they could design not just a whole suite of technologies, but a whole new branch of physics effectively. And within 4 years, produce these devastating end products as a result of that. Now, you might not think the Manhattan Project is a great model, and it's not, except that it shows what you can do if you've got the political will. How quickly you can turn things around, even when a technology doesn't yet exist.
Well,
even when
we don't have any political will. I mean, COP27 made a much bigger splash than probably all the other COPs before it. COP28 made a very small splash, though it was a smaller conference. There has been no fire set underneath government.
No. So this is why it really is up to us. We can't sit and wait for governments to deliver because they're not going to deliver. We need massive citizens' movements, and we saw it starting with like Extinction Rebellion, Fridays for Future, and groups like that. But it pretty well got snuffed out by the pandemic, and we really need to rebuild it as quickly as possible, because it was getting to the point, especially with Fridays for Future, where right across Western Europe, governments were about to turn. It was really, really close, and then the pandemic brought it all to an end. So it's very frustrating, but it shows it can be done. But we can't afford to leave politics to politicians. We have to recognise that we are as much in politics as they are.
To quote somebody who might be on the call with me, looking at me, politics is a failure of imagination, I think, is something around that. Though sometimes I wonder, is it the politicians' imagination or the country's imagination or the voters? It's kind of a collective thing. It's not just at the door of
failure.
Yeah.
Political failure is a failure of imagination.
Yeah. But there's many of us there. Let's go through a couple of questions on some of this. This will be slightly coming at different angles. But Kerry says, if you can make a better product and people want to buy it, so I think we're thinking about foodstuffs here, it surely doesn't matter that farmers aren't happy with it. If the market will move on and adapt if the demand is there. So, but you need more than just Tesco, Sainsbury's, Lidl and Aldi to start stocking better flour or better produce. I mean, the vegetarian range from Linda McCartney did not kind of take off and populate more than one shelf full. It's we've seen this before. So how do you get the food industry to actually pull this behind them?
So the new products we're talking about won't be anything like the old ones. I mean, the old products were very poor substitutes for animal products. I'm not. There's no disrespect. Linda McCartney done as well as they can with the very limited materials that they had. But plant, you wouldn't start from here. You wouldn't start with plant proteins if you're trying to make something which is like animal products. But starting from microbial proteins, you've got this massively greater opportunity to produce something which is effectively identical and much cheaper. That is the fundamental problem with so many of the plant-based products. They are actually a lot more expensive than the things they're substituting, and the quality is worse. That's beginning to change. Some of them are really quite good, but they're still quite expensive. And so you need to massively ramp up the quality, you need to bring down the price. And if you're producing something which is effectively identical and it's cheaper than animal products, and because unicellular production is so efficient, that's not going to take long, then you see very rapid substitution indeed. It'll start with like the fast food companies that say, well, why are we buying actual chicken when you can buy something which is just like chicken and you can make chicken nuggets out of it at half the price? Why are we buying actual beef for these burgers when you can make burgers which taste exactly the same for half the price? That's when the change starts to happen, and then it flips very quickly. And Kerry's exactly right. It's once the market logic has kicked in, then ultimately all the rest is just noise, and it will happen. And this is why, again, farmers should be getting ahead of this, recognizing that the writing's on the wall, and changing out of the old way of doing things as quickly as possible.
Breeze says, I suppose we're having a conversation here about this. I'm not equipped to, I can interrogate you about it, but I'm not equipped to tell you that you're wrong with evidence kind of behind it. Your book is very thick, hundreds of pages, and has lots of, about a quarter of it at the back is just the kind of the references to other places where you would find out more. So you are coming from a kind of, you're arguing what feels like a fairly well thought out position. But I mean, do you come up against much criticism? Are there those who say that George Monbiot has been kind of drinking too late at night and coming up with fantastical ideas? And actually, what Breeze kind of says, is there evidence? It's just disappeared off my screen. But is there evidence? That actually we could make rotation agriculture much more sustainable. We could make it more viable. We could improve that, and that would, I guess, that would do rightly for another 10 or 20 years while we perfect other techniques.
Well, I mean, we definitely need to improve our production of grain and improve our production of fruit and veg, and we need more fruit and veg. We should be eating more of that. We're going to continue to need grain, whether it's wheat, maize, soy, rice, whatever it is, beans, oil seeds. We'll still need all that, and we need to do it better. We need to produce it much better. And there's some very exciting new approaches, and one of them is perennial grain crops. Almost all the grain we grow today comes from annual plants, plants which live and die within 1 year. And they require a huge amount of pampering and an awful lot of environmental destruction to grow. But if you can grow grain from plants which stay in the ground for several years at a time, you're greatly reducing the amount of destruction and the amount of chemicals and the amount of water and all the other help those plants need. Because once they're established, they're much stronger than those annual plants. The roots go down deeper, they're more resilient to environmental shocks, they can better fight off pests, they need less fertilizer, less water, all the rest of it. And this has been a dream of scientists for about a century, but it's finally being realized. It's led by a group called the Land Institute in Kansas. And they've been scanning thousands of potential candidates across the living world as plants which could either in their own right become perennial crops or can be hybridized with our annual crops. And they've had one complete success, which is a variety of rice which has now been fully commercialized in conjunction with Yunnan University in China. And it's been grown across tens of thousands of hectares now of China. Farmers are desperate for the seed because they've found they get the same yields or slightly higher than they get from annual rice, but with far less ploughing, far less herbicides, pesticides, fertilizers, far less labor, which is in really short supply, and far less soil erosion because you're doing less ploughing. And yet they can just crop that same plant year after year after year. And the Land Institute and others are now developing a whole range of other cereals, of legumes, of oil crops, which live for several years at a time. And that is one of several. I think the most exciting of all the new ways of growing food. But that's great for growing grain. And it's great, or some of the new techniques for growing vegetables, that's brilliant. But the one thing we can't produce with any further efficiency, except for tiny, tiny amounts, is animals. That is the thing that we just can't afford, the thing the planet can't afford. We just producing our food from animals is just too expensive in environmental terms.
I feel the ghost of Rob Hopkins over my shoulder, though he's probably much closer to actually where you're sitting than where I am. We were talking to him yesterday on the first day of the festival, and his kind of notion of stopping talking about what is, but talking about what if. Today you've been kind of talking quite a lot about what if we had a way of doing this stuff more sustainably. What if we could rewild by needing less land for animals and so on. There is also, though, there is a real problem here at the moment where we have people, even in the West, and we have food banks in rich West nations, because not everybody is actually rich, and not everybody, and the current cost of living crisis is really exacerbating that. So. Where do you stand on kind of the interim measures as we try and actually provide affordable food to everybody? And I'm even thinking selfishly within the UK and Ireland as opposed to kind of thinking of kind of third world countries. But even here, if we can dwell here for a minute, it's quite a conundrum though.
Well, I mean, it's monstrous that people in these incredibly rich nations are having to queue at the food bank to survive. And I interviewed people in my local food bank. I was just horrified to hear what life they are now having to lead. And what I was told again and again is, this is the only cost we can cut. If you don't pay the rent, you get evicted. If you don't pay the bills, you get cut off. The only cost you can cut is food, and that's why we're at the food bank, because otherwise we'd starve. And this is fundamentally a problem of inequality. These are tremendously rich nations. There's plenty of money to go around, but it's been hoarded by the very rich. And so we need a much better distribution of wealth. That should be the starting point of any such discussions. But we can go further than that and say, look, the reason so many people are trapped into eating unhealthy food is that unhealthy food is generally a lot cheaper than healthy food. And the answer is not to make unhealthy food more expensive, which some people seem to suggest, because then you'd have even more people going hungry. The answer is to make healthy food cheaper. And one way of doing that is to redeploy another part of the subsidy package specifically towards making healthy food cheaper. Now, on the whole, subsidies don't make food cheaper at all. They're just a massive, great gift to the biggest farmers, which all of us are making it, and often to do incredibly destructive and stupid things. But we could deploy some of that money to subsidise the sale of fruit and vegetables at the point of sale. So in other words, the producers still get paid the same, but you pay less for them. So I did a calculation for the UK as a whole to look at what would happen if you cut the price in half and the result was a doubling in purchases of fruit and vegetables. Amazingly, it would only cost £3 billion a year, which actually, in terms of public accounts, is a drop in the ocean. And you would save far more in terms of visits to the NHS if people were eating more fruit and vegetables. It's such an obvious step to take. But instead, we're squandering, as it happens, £3 billion a year on farm subsidies in the United Kingdom, which are delivering no public benefit at all. It's just a complete waste of money at the moment. And I know it is changing. It's changing towards a different system. Now we're out of the European Union. I mean, I was a Remainer, but if I'd voted purely on agricultural issues, I would have been a Leaver, because the Common Agricultural Policy is one of the biggest environmental disasters on earth. But we're still seeing a lot of this money being squandered, and let's spend some of it on making healthy food cheaper.
Are you hopeful? Do you have much hope that aspects of this or all of this can happen in your lifetime, or before it's too late and we run out of land, run out of temperature? I mean,
well, these things can happen very quickly if we want them to. It's not just that governments can turn things around at tremendous speed if they choose, as we saw in the 1940s, but it's also that citizens can turn things around at tremendous speed if they choose, because society, being a complex system, has tipping points, and we know roughly where those tipping points are, because there's been quite a lot of observational and experimental evidence developed on this, and it's about 25%. When about 25% of people are committed to a new idea or a new position, it's very hard then to resist that. And we've seen these extremely rapid transformations happening before. So, for instance, with smoking, when 20 years ago, you were smoking everywhere. In indoor spaces, it was a fug of smoke, and then almost overnight, it stopped. Similarly, with marriage equality, it wasn't long ago. I'm sure there's still a few people in certain parties in Northern Ireland who believe that marriage equality is the work of the devil, and that it'll bring down civilization as we know it. And then it just swept across Western Europe, as a result of very effective campaigning by gay rights activists. And now you meet a lot of people who were opposed to it, who say, "Oh yes, of course, I've always been in favour of marriage equality," because we are the hypersocial mammal. We got our antennae twitching. Well, mammals don't have antennae. Our whiskers twitching all the time to see which way the wind is blowing. And if we perceive that the wind has changed, we quickly turn around to catch that new wind. We don't want to be left behind. And so, when things start to tip, I think they can tip very quickly, but particularly with issues like this, because you can get what I call a techno-ethical shift. So the technology lifts the lid on the latent demand for change. We saw that with the development of the printing press and the switch from parchment to paper. We saw it with the development of modern contraceptive technologies, which gave a massive boost to women's liberation. The moment something becomes amendable is the moment it becomes intolerable. And so if you suddenly can produce a better, cheaper way of producing products which are almost identical to animal products, that's the moment you say, so why the hell are we killing 76 billion animals a year? Why are we treating them so appallingly? Why are we trashing the living world just to feed ourselves, when we can do it in a different way? That's when the techno-ethical shift happens.
I think I can nearly guarantee that you will upset some of the evangelical Protestants with their, because you're totally unbiblical with getting rid of sheep who are all over the New Testament and the Old Testament, but I suspect that's a battle we shall fight another day. Can I thank you, George, for your time? I'm noticing on the back of the book, Yanis Varoufakis, who is no stranger to Imagine Festival over the years. He speaks about the book being like a poem, and I think actually the prose in it is beautifully written. You could have given me a list of facts and I couldn't have kind of created such a nice story out of it. The chapters are beautiful to read, so it was a pleasure kind of doing my homework for this. Later on tonight, there's another online event on climate change, asking, is there any hope? Let's hope the answer is yes. That's at 7:30. If you want to get out of the house, check out John Otway's Belfast comeback gig, Rock and Roll's Greatest Failure. It's on in the Black Box at 8. There's another 100 or so events in the programme, which finally closes on Sunday evening. But basically, George, a big thank you to you and to the audience who supplied some of those questions. Thank you for your time this afternoon. Best wishes with selling your dream, selling maybe your reality of what it should be, and may everybody else enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alan. Great to talk to you.